Although I thought we were going to put music on. All right. Let's see if this is live. It is. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this workshop. Welcome to FlaskCon. And so we're here from sunny Scotland. No, it's not sunny, of course. We're here to start working with Flask, HTMX, TailwindCSS, and AlpineJS. So this is a collection of tools that have, well, especially HTMX has gotten a bit of a reputation for not being serious tools, but they very much are. And together, these tools can add just enough interactivity and engagingness to your website without adding too much complexity. With that said, the method of development that I'm going to show you in this workshop is a good method for developing your project the first time that you write the code for it, when you're still validating it, getting product market fit. And over time, as your project gets more complicated, maybe the methodology that I'm going to show you here will need revised. Because there is something about rapid development, which is that it can sometimes be a little bit messy as you're getting your ideas out there and you just want to develop as fast as possible. And as such, you may need to rewrite some code over time. But that's normal. Rewriting your projects is normal. So let's get started developing as quickly as possible, and then we'll go from there. So a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We've got a Discord server, the Palettes Discord server. It's linked in the description of the YouTube live stream. So it's discord.gg/palettes. You can join that to ask any questions. You can also ask on the YouTube chat if you prefer. Yeah, and it seems that we're live, so that's all good. So you can do that, and also you should follow along with me while I'm coding. So as you can see in my screen, I've got an empty project with nothing in it, and that's how we're going to start. We also have, or we will have, let me bring it in here, a documentation page with information, and this is kind of like the slides for this session. These slides are going to be shared after the session is over. For now, I will be walking you through all of this live. You'll be coding with me. So if you want to follow along with me, I encourage you to do so. Just start a new empty project in your editor of choice, and we can get started. Okay, and I knew this would happen. I've forgotten to record it locally, so let me also start recording locally. My local recording doesn't work, so we're going to ignore the local recording for the time being. Should have tested that, probably. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is set up a new Python project. And there's been a lot of development in Python packaging world over the years. There's a good project called Rye. So let me bring it up. It's at ryeup.com. And funnily enough, the original developer of Flask has made this project, which is a way to set up your Python projects, including your Python installation, dependencies, development dependencies, and various other things. So I'm going to be using Rye. Installing is very easy. It works on all platforms. So I recommend that you do that. And it's very straightforward. Here you can see that in order to start a project with Rye, all that we have to do is do a Rye init, and then go into the directory and pin a specific Python version. And as you want to add dependencies, you just do Rye add. And then when you want to install them, you do Rye sync. And if you want to run a command within the virtual environment, such as Flask or your documentation or database migrations, whatever you need, you do Rye run, and then whatever command that you'd like to run. So let's do that. So we'll do init. We'll initialize locally with the dot, and then we can simply add our dependency. So we'll do write add dot env. When you've got these extras with the square brackets, you always have to put them inside quotation marks. Then we'll do JinJa partials and feed parser. Because the project that we're going to be building in this workshop is in an RSS feed parser that's going to have some interactivity and so forth. So we'll add those three. And this doesn't install any dependencies. We have to do write sync in order to install them. And we're going to use this virtual environment. So you can see that by default, Rye will create a virtual environment in the .venv folder inside your current project, which is all good. And it also creates a source code folder that we are not going to be using. But you can. And then we've got sort of the git ignore, the Python version, and all that good stuff. So then the next thing that we want to do is create our Flask app sort of setup. We're going to have the under init py, and this is what's going to start when we start our Flask app. To create a sample simple Flask app, we're just going to do from Flask import Flask, and then app is Flask, and pass it under name to start a Flask app or to create a Flask app with the current import name if we are using any. And then we'll simply do app route, and this gives us an endpoint for sending requests to our Flask app, and then we can define a function that will run when we receive an HTTP request at this endpoint, and we can return some text. That's it. This is a simple Flask app. Now we should be able to do run Flask run, and we need to pass in the app that we want to run. So we'll create a new file called Flask env. Flask app is, you can do this, is that right? Because we want to look for the Flask app in the current directory. And that is going to look in dunder init.py first of all. So far, we're going quite quickly because we don't have unlimited time and we have a lot to get through. So I'm assuming that you have some knowledge of Flask and sort of how it works and sort of the initial setup and so forth. If you have any questions, remember that you can ask in the Discord server or in the YouTube chat, and we'll be more than happy to help you out. Saying that, I do have a limited number of screens, so I don't think I can check everything simultaneously. Okay, yeah, there you go. But I can. All right, so now we've got our Flask running. We can do 127.0.0.1:5000, and we trigger the / endpoint when we make a request with our browser, and we get the response, hello world. Now, instead of returning strings, you can also return dictionaries, which will get them turned into JSON, particularly useful for APIs, or you can return HTML using some helper functions within Flask, and then you can render sort of templates and stuff like that. Talking about templates, let's create our templates. So by default, when you create a templates folder in the same folder as your Flask application, Flask will sort of, well, that's the default place where the Flask app is going to look for HTML templates. So we're creating the templates folder in the same file, in the same place as dunder init.py. And then in here, we're going to create base.html. Okay, that's fine. That's my linter. That's okay. Now, base.html is going to be a template that contains some of the boilerplate that HTML documents like to contain. And our other templates are not going to have to contain this boilerplate because we're just going to inject content into here dynamically. Boilerplate in HTML is the doc type that tells the browser what kind of document you're making, the HTML tag with the language, head for scripts and metadata and stuff like that, and the body for the actual content. So here in the body, we're going to define a block. A block is a JinJa construct. So Flask is a very minimal framework which ships with a number of other libraries in order to aid it in the development of websites and so on. And JinJa is one of those. JinJa allows us to define templates. And what I'm going to do, by the way, before I continue, is I'm going to install djlint. So I'll say right add. So it's not bugging us. But it didn't work. One second. Should be here. Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay. Let's disable it then. Never mind. We won't install that. We'll just make it go away. So JinJa will allow us to define these places where we can inject content. For example, here we've got our base.html template, and then we can define another template that inherits from this one and only puts content within the content block. Similarly, when we tell Flask to render a template, we can pass values that will be interpolated into the template code. And that's how we can do server-side rendering with Flask. We can have a template that has dynamic content based on the request or some other state. So this is all that we need for the base template. And now we're going to add a few of our dependencies. Some of the dependencies that we are going to add are, of course, the stuff that we are going to cover in this workshop. And so we've got TailwindCSS, HTMX, and AlpineJS. Now, TailwindCSS just got a script that we can load from a CDN, so you can just put that in the head of your project. And if I disable this, reload required. Okay. Let me reload this thing 1 sec. There you go. Okay, that just needed to be reloaded, so make it go away. And that is the Tailwind CSS script. So there is a small problem with loading Tailwind CSS in this way, which is that it's a little bit inefficient. The better way would be to install Tailwind CSS using the Node package manager, npm, and then run Tailwind CSS by feeding it your HTML files, and then it is a bit more efficient because it can remove any parts of Tailwind CSS that you are not using in your code, so your CSS file becomes a little bit smaller. But we're doing rapid development here, so we can just keep it like that. If you want to learn more about how to use Tailwind CSS with npm, you can check out the docs. Normally, when I'm moving on to the next stage of development from this rapid development style to a more production-ready application, one of the first things I'll do is I will take my time to set up Tailwind CSS, because you can essentially remove everything that you don't need, and you can minify the CSS code, and it reduces the size of your CSS file substantially, which results in faster page loads. So that's something that's recommended. But later on, right now, we're not too bothered. There is a side benefit of loading from a CDN, which is that so many websites use Tailwind CSS that it's likely already cached by your user's browser. So in some cases, this could actually be faster. So that's to say there is no simply good option and the bad option. You always have to make some decisions and some trade-offs. Okay, so now that we've got Tailwind CSS, we are going to bring in HTMX. And don't worry, we're just bringing in dependencies, but later on, I will, well, as we go through this workshop, I'll show you what each one of these is for and what it can do and how we'll use them to build our project. HTMX is a JavaScript library that allows elements to make HTTP requests, even though they are not links or forms, and then your website can respond to those requests in different ways. Finally, the last dependency that we're going to add is AlpineJS. We'll use this toward the end of the workshop. And AlpineJS is another JavaScript library that we can use to add interactivity within the page without making requests to our backend. So HTMX is all about making requests, receiving responses, and dealing with them dynamically within the page. AlpineJS is going to be used just within the page without interacting with our backend. Right. So, okay. Sorry, I'm just checking the comments. Jonathan, Rye, yeah, Rye seems awesome. A couple of issues, as you can see, some issues here in the live stream with DJ Lint for some reason. And Abdur, DJ Lint is the only way I found to lint and format JinJa documents in VS Code without it going just all janky and JinJa blocks and everything ending up all over the place. So I would quite like to get it installed, but it doesn't seem to work for some reason, and I'm not going to figure it out right now. But yeah, definitely two nice tools. Okay, now we've got our dependencies. We're ready to move on. Now, there is a dependency that I surreptitiously installed at the beginning of the project, and that's JinJa partials. So JinJa partials is a very small library, surprisingly, forgotten the word now, but some people like it, some people don't. Basically, JinJa partials allows us to define HTML fragments that we're going to render in other JinJa templates. And when we get to using it, I'll show you some alternatives to JinJa partials and why they're not as good. But in JinJa, you've got a few different ways of doing that. You've got a few different ways of bringing in code from one template file into another template file. And JinJa partials is the best way to do it, in my opinion, especially with HTMX. And like I said, I'll show you why later on. We're going to skip the partials versus components section for the time being, and we're going to move directly into a website without reloading. So let me close everything here except the dunder init.py, and we're going to do a little bit of work on our Flask app. We're building an RSS reader. So the first thing that we need for an RSS reader is our feeds. And I'm going to bring in this dictionary of feeds. And what we've got here is this. And so we've got a dictionary that maps a link to a feed. I will copy this and show you what this looks like. This is an RSS feed. It contains information about the latest blog posts, in this case in our blog, or you can bring in any other blog. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a link to that as a string, and the value that is mapped to is some dictionary with the title, the link, a Boolean, whether to show images or not, and the entries. Entries are the individual blog posts or articles that are part of this RSS feed. And this is the link that we're going to load. Now, there is a library that we've already installed called Feed Parser. And when you give it a link with Feed Parser, it can sort of break it down into an object that you can interact more easily rather than just having a bunch of XML. So we'll do import Feed Parser, we'll do import JinJa partials, and we are going to import render template from Flask as well. And what I'll do is, for the time being, I'm going to move my notes to my other screen. So you've got a bit more space here to look at the code. Now, what we have to do is initialize JinJa partials. So we'll say JinJa partials, register extensions, and we'll pass in the Flask app. And all this does is it allows us to use JinJa partials within our JinJa templates. And then we will define our homepage, which is going to be called render feed. And in here, all that we're going to do is grab the first feed and we're going to render it. So we'll say feed is feeds values, or sorry, keys 0. We'll say parsed feed is feed parser parse, and we'll simply pass in the feed URL. We'll improve this in a minute. And then we'll say render template, in fact, and we'll say feed.html, which we need to create. And feed is feed, and feeds is feeds. Feed is parsed feed. So what we're doing here is we are going to take this HTML template. We're going to pass two values to it, feed and feeds. And then within that template, we can use those two values and we can build out our page. So let's create feed.html. And in here, we can say, first of all, extends in order to be able to define a block content. The content inside this block will get interpolated into here. So it will replace this stuff, so we don't need any of the boilerplate. And what we're also going to do is disable GitHub Copilot. Now, what we are going to do in here is simply say the feed to begin with. So let me put this in here. We have to restart our app. We get an internal server error. Oh yeah, of course, because wait, list, that's my bad. Let's restart that again. There we have it. So you can set up Flask to automatically restart your code whenever you make code changes and all sorts. For the time being, we're not going to do that, but it's fairly straightforward. So there you go. This is what our feed looks like when we parse it using feed parser. Now, what we want to do is display this in a slightly nicer way, but you'll see that there is a list of entries in here, and each one has, well, in the case of this specific feed, it actually contains the entire content. All of the entire blog post is in here. Some other feeds won't contain the entire content. They will only show you a summary of the feed. So feeds can be constructed in a variety of ways. So that's something that we'll have to be careful with when we're developing our application. Let's go back into feed.html and we're going to make it a little bit more interesting. So what we're going to do is, first of all, we'll use the feeds value that we're passing in, which is this dictionary, to construct a navigation. So we can say for feed URL and feed in feeds.items. Since this is a dictionary, we can just iterate over the keys and values in one go using items. And then we can define a list item, and we'll put an unordered list around it. Now within each list item, we'll put a link, and the href is going to be we'll do nothing for now, and we'll bring that back in a moment. And we'll do feed item. So far we've learned that this is how we can create some JinJa blocks, such as for loops, and this is how we create a JinJa expression that allows us to interpolate a value into the link. And now we're putting in the title of the feed. Okay, so let's refresh this. Restart the app. Now we've got our two titles in there. Now, TailwindCSS is a very good way of developing this kind of navigation. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in some Tailwind elements. So I'm going to put them in here. And in Tailwind CSS, we can pass classes to our HTML elements, and each class will apply a certain bit of CSS. So, sorry, just checking the chats. There we go. So hidden will make the thing hidden. Because this that we're developing here, this navigation is a sidebar, so we want it to be hidden initially, and when the screen size is large, we want it to appear. And in that case, it's going to be in a fixed position. Then we've got a few other things, such as this flex, the width of the element, and the sort of layout, and so on. If you don't know anything about CSS, then Tailwind CSS looks a bit scary, but if you learn just a little bit of CSS, you'll see that this makes writing the CSS a bit faster. So what we're going to do here is have a hidden element that only appears in a large screen. Then within that, we have another div that contains the navigation. And inside that navigation, we've got the UL. And then after that, we'll start closing our divs. Now, this UL here, we are going to give it a role of list and some classes, flex, flex1, flex call, and gap y3. This, again, renders it using a flex and then makes it into a column, so elements appear one on top of each other and gives them a small gap between elements. Although this looks very confusing, it's all basically the same thing. We're telling elements to render as a column, and we're giving them a small gap, again a column, and then again a column. So we're just telling Tailwind CSS that this is how the elements should be rendered one on top of each other, and we are good to go. So let's save this, restart our app. And when the screen size is large, the elements appear. When the screen size is small, they disappear. We can also give some classes to this anchor element. So we'll say class, and we will pass in some classes here. We're going to say, I'm going to bring some in. We're going to say that it's rounded and it's got a background. So we'll say BG green 500, for example. We'll do 700, and we'll do text white. So we're going to give it a background, white text, and then it's going to be a flex element. It has rounded radiuses. The text is small. The line height is slightly larger than usual, and the font is semi-bold, and there's some padding. So all of this sort of makes more sense the more you look at it. For the time being, it doesn't if you're not used to Tailwind CSS, but I'm sure you'll be able to see how this is faster than having a separate CSS file and having to faff about with CSS class names and styles and all that. So there you have it. Now you've got your two links in there, and they're styled, and this appears on a small size. Now, what we want to do is do it so only when the current page is for one of these that they have the appropriate background. So we'll do that in a moment. Okay, so now that we have our CSS, we are ready to deal with the next bit, which is actually rendering the different entries for our RSS feeds. In order to do that, we are going to create a partial. So let's go over to templates. We'll create a folder called partials, and then we will create entry.html. And here is where the JinJa partials are going to come in handy, because we are going to find an HTML fragment that will accept some arguments, and we'll just render the HTML for the summarized entry and nothing else. There is no boilerplate. There is no extends base.html or anything like that. The code in here will just get interpolated into where we tell it to. And this is a good place to wonder whether you should use a JinJa macro, because JinJa comes with macros, or a JinJa include. When you define a macro, which you can do, you can say entry, and then you can have the parameters in here and so forth. And macro. It is something that JinJa has, and it's basically a function call. And the problem with this is entry.html cannot be rendered from Flask, such as we've done here, render template feed.html. We wouldn't be able to render template entry.html if we wanted to, because the macro needs to be called in order for the contents of the macro to be used. So this is fine if you're never going to want to render the entry on its own from Flask, but it's not fine if you want to be able to do that. The alternative is to use a JinJa include, but when you use a JinJa include, it's not so easy to pass in arguments. So that is where JinJa partials comes into play. It's kind of like a mixture of both. You can call the partial and pass arguments when you do that, and you can also render it on its own, because it is, after all, just HTML that we're going to write in here. Okay, I am going to bring in the code because there's a lot of TailwindCSS that I don't want to really explain because we don't have all day. But let me show you, or let me talk about what this does. So we define an article, an HTML article. Then if media content, which may be true or false, that's not true. If media content, which is the post image, is present, which it may not be present, then we're going to render an image. And we pass in the source there, which is the media content value, the URL from the RSS feed. Then we'll show it. And then we've got some more information. We've got the title of the entry, published by who and on what day. There's a summary and a link to read the article, which takes you to the link itself. All that we've got here are some HTML elements. You can make this as simple and as unstyled as you want. But with Tailwind CSS, it's fairly rapid to develop once you get more familiar with it. Okay, just checking the chat. That's fine. Now that we've got this partial defined in here, we can go into feed.html and we can render the partial. So what we'll say is, after all of these divs, we'll define another one, and we'll say that this div should leave enough room for the sidebar. So we'll say padding left 2. And then we'll define the main content. At the top and bottom, we'll say 10. And then we'll say sort of for item in feed entries values, another JinJa for loop. And now we will call render partial. And we want to say partials entry.html. And this is how you call the partial, and we can pass in the values that we need. And let me just grab that. We've got the item title, item published, item summary, item media content, item author, and item link. So these are just things that are coming directly from the feed parser library. That's it. So let's restart this and rerun our app. Oh, and of course, we've got a small error in here because feed entries is empty. So let's deal with that first. Here. go back to our Python file. And up till now, all that we've got is the feed parser feed, but we need to populate the entries dictionary in here. When you do feed parser.parse, you get a list of entries. We want to turn them into a dictionary of entries, similar to what we've got in our RSS feed dictionary. So we'll do change this slightly. We'll do for URL and feed in feeds.items. Parsed feed is feed parser.parse. I'm passing the URL, and then we'll go through the entries in this parsed feed, and we will populate the entries in there. So we'll say for entry in parsed feeds. If entry link is not already in the entries that we've got, then we'll add it. Now, this may seem a little bit complicated, but later on it's going to come in handy. Later on, we will be modifying the entries dictionary, and we don't want to be replacing it every time. So that's why we are kind of going through them and updating the dictionary instead of simply doing, feed entries equal entries or whatnot. Okay, so this updates all of our RSS feeds. It goes through each one. It parses the feed, gets the entries, and populates the entries dictionary. Now we need to pick which feed specifically we're going to pass to the template, because we can render the entries of one feed or the other. So for now, we'll say feed is list of feeds values 0, and we will simply do that. Great, let's restart this again. And there we have our RSS feed. Each one of these is the partial that we created, and they are rendered. It renders all of the entries in the RSS feed. If you go to a different one, it doesn't work because we haven't coded it yet. So let's do that. When we click on one of them, we want to go to a specific feed, or we want to grab a specific feed as opposed to only the first one. And we can do that with Flask by saying app route, and we'll say /feed/path feed URL. And this will allow us to say /feed/https, blah, 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 blah. And then what we'll do is if here, feed URL, is a string, and it's going to default to none. Say if feed URL, then is none, we will do this. Otherwise, we will grab that feed URL. We'll say feed is feeds URL, and this is where this dictionary is coming in handy, because we can simply access the appropriate feed using this index. We don't have to go through them again to find which one we want to actually load. So I'll restart the app again, and we can refresh the page. And now if we go to /feed/link, we get this RSS feed instead of the other one. So we're going very quickly, but we're already 34 minutes through. Oh my God, time is flying. Let me check the Discord. Okay, we're all good. Right. Okay. So remember, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Or if I'm going too quickly, you can also say, and I can skip the last couple of bits and go a bit slower. The next thing we want to do in any case is fix this navigation. So all that we want to do is each one of these is going to be a link to /feed/ and then the appropriate URL. So what we'll say is if the URL is where we're at, we'll color that one in. And if it isn't, then we won't. So only one of them will be green. To do that, let's go to feed.html. And in here, we'll say that this stuff here, we only want to add if we are at the right place. So we'll say like this, using JinJa, we can interpolate this string if feed.href, and remember, feed is the currently selected feed. So we'll say if feed.href is equal to feed underscore, which is what we're using to iterate over all of the feeds, href. Otherwise, we're gonna but there is also actually one more thing that we have to do, and that is, of course, put the link. So we'll say URL for render feed, which is our function. So we'll say URL for this, and we'll pass in the appropriate feed URL. So we'll say feed URL equal to feed. Yeah. So let's restart the app. And now this. But you can see that the page does reload in between when you click a link, right? So this is not very, it's a bit slow. It's not very interactive. And you'll see sort of spinners when you, and your document request when you click on one of these links. So we can use HTMX to fix that. And now this is where we are adding the HTMX. In order to prevent a page load, we can use HTMX to, when we click on one of the links, it will make a request to our backend and will receive the HTML response, but then it will simply replace the page content with the response instead of making a new page load. In order to do that, all that we have to do is in these elements, we can add hx boost. That's it. Now, when we and we change the link, there is no page load. You can see there is no blinking of the URL address bar. It's not going to a different page. It's just bringing in the response from Flask and replacing the page content. And that feels just a little bit snappier. But we can do a lot more with HTMX, of course. But HX Boost is a good sort of starting point for using HTMX, because whenever you want to add just that little bit of interactivity and not having all the page loads, you can add that to your links, and that's a good start. All right, so that was the first part of this workshop on sort of getting set up. Now we're going to add pagination using HTMX. And this is where things get a little bit more, well, not tricky, because this is rapid development and it's fairly straightforward, but where you have to be a little bit more careful in how you structure the different parts. Just checking the chats. Okay, that's fine. All right. Okay, so the structure of our application is like this. Let me bring this away. this is what we are going to be working on. We're going to be adding a new component, this page component, that contains 5 entries and a button to show more entries, to kind of load more, if you will. There are a few different ways that you may think this should be done. And sort of intuitively, you may not think that the entries and the button should be in the same partial. But it's going to make it much easier, because when you render a page, you can tell that page which page it is, and then to load the next one, you just need to add 1 to that page. Whereas if you put the button outside the page, then you need to keep some sort of global state about which page you're on, so that when you click the button, it loads the next page, even though the button itself hasn't been rendered with that knowledge, i.e., you need JavaScript to keep that that state somewhere. And in order to avoid the JavaScript, for now, we're going to do this. And I think this is a very sort of simplistic approach that nonetheless works quite well. So let's do that. One second. So the first thing to do is go into partials and create entry page.html. And in here, all that we need to do is move this for loop that we had in here, this whole for loop, we're going to move it in there to render all of the entries. But instead of feed entries.values, we're just going to receive a list or an iterable of entries, and then we're going to render them like that. Now in feed.html, we can then render that partial. So we'll say render partial partials entry page.html, and pass in entries is feed entries values. Now if we refresh the page, nothing changes, because we've not really changed anything. We've just rendered the partial, which does the exact same thing as it did before. But now this entry page can be rendered with some more information. So what we're going to render in here is an if statement. And this template is now going to receive four values. It's going to receive entries. So let's write that down. Entries. It's going to receive the page, the current page that we're in, the max page, because we will know beforehand how many entries are in the feed, and we don't want to show the button to load the next page if I'm going to delete that. I'm going to bring it in a moment. We don't want to show the button if we're already at the last page. And then it's also going to receive href, which is a link to the feed that we're currently loading. So let's go back to under init, and we're going to code the next endpoint, which is to render that partial. Now, this is a way that I'm using HTMX and partials where they have related state or state that can just be stored within one partial. You can then create an endpoint to render that partial on its own, and then use HTMX to replace that partial into somewhere else with all the state that it already uses. So we'll do app.route, and we'll say entries and pass in the feed URL, and then render feed entries. And it's the feed URL, which is a string. And what this endpoint is going to do is it's going to just render 5 entries and the button. So it's going to get 5 entries from the feed and then render the appropriate template. So we'll say try feed is feeds feed URL. And if we don't have key feed URL in our feeds dictionary, then we're just going to abort, say or just returns a 400 status code to the browser, and it tells you that error. Then we're also going to grab the current page, and that is going to come in really string parameters. So there's a question mark page equal 1 or whatnot. So we'll see int request args get, and we'll get the page. And by default, the page will be 0, and we need to import request. Okay, then we will render the entry page. So we'll say render template. We'll say partials entry page.html, and now we pass in the entries. And the entries is going to be a list of the feed entries values. And so that gives us all of the entries in the feed, but we're only going to get 5 of them given the current page. If you were loading this from a database, then you would only load 5 entries from the database. Here, we already have all of the entries, so pagination is not going to give us any performance benefit, but it is going to mean that the page itself isn't like humongous doing this sort of pagination. So no performance benefit here. You would have performance benefit if you use a database. It's still going to be a usability improvement. So now we'll say page times 5 and page times 5 plus 5. So this is a slice in Python. Lets us get items from this list from this index to this index. So it'll be like if it's page 1, it'll be from 5 to 10. So it'll give us 5 pages. And then the href is going to be feed href. The page is going to be the page. And the max page. Because we can have, or we know all of the entries, we can simply say len of feed entries. And do an integer division by 5 to get page. All right. So now that we've got this, we can go back to entry page, grab that function name, and this button, we can make a request to that endpoint. So what we'll say is when we click the button, we will make a get request. So we'll say hx get, and it'll be URL 4. Render feed entries. The feed URL is href, and the page is page plus 1. Because this button knows the page it's on, load more can just get the next one. But doing a hx get on its own isn't enough. We also have to tell HTMX what to do with the response. So we'll say hx swap. What is HTMX going to do with the HTML response that this endpoint returns? And it's going to swap the outer HTML. And what is it going to swap? Well, hx target could be this. And that is just going to replace this button by the next page of feed, which contains its own button. And so you do have to be careful with hx target. You can target, some ID if you want to target a specific ID. We'll do that in a moment. But at this moment, because this is just rendering a list of divs, I think, articles, we can just add more articles instead of this button and then have the button at the bottom. It's not like we have to put the articles in a specific container or something like that. Okay, let's see what happens when we run this. Well, that is what happens. Let's see. Maybe I made a mistake here. Yes, I did. Okay. 1 sec. Yes, I did. Yeah. Okay, sorry, that's my bad. We still have a small issue in feed.html because we're rendering the partial, but we're not passing all the required arguments. So here is another use case for HTMX, because when you first render the partial, you oftentimes can pass in the required state. So we need page, max page, and href. So we can say page is 0, right? Max page is, we don't really know at this time. Let's say 10, but this is what the problem is with this sort of localized state. I'll show you how to fix this in a second. And the href is feed href, right? Start. Refresh the page. And you can see that it doesn't work. Why not? Because when we are rendering the first partial here in entry page, we are passing all of the entries, and this partial renders all of the entries that are passed to it. So this is one of these instances where we don't want to call render partial in this page. What we want to do is call this endpoint and render whatever this endpoint says into the page on page load. So when the page loads, we're going to know what feed we're currently looking at. And then we want to make a call to that endpoint and inject the response. So doing this has the problem where we don't know some of the state, and also we are passing too many values. And you certainly don't want to do that in here. And this, I don't even think this would work, because I'm not sure if JinJa has list. You'd have to use a filter. You don't want to do this because then if you want to change the pagination size, you have to change it in 2 places. It's a mess. So we don't want to do that. We want to instead ask HTMX to make a request, and then the response gets injected in here. And by default, wrong place. By default, the page will be 0 at the beginning, and we can just inject the response here, and that creates the first button to load to the next page as well. So it's all good. So let's create a div, and we're going to give it some padding. I'll say in small, padding 6, and in large, padding 8. And now we are going to give it an ID, entries, because we may want to target this later on. We'll ask this div to make a request to that endpoint and replace itself or its content for the response. So we'll say hxget, and this will be URL4 and render feed entries. Render feed entries like that. The feed URL is the current feed href. And the page can be 0, but you don't have to pass it because that's the default. This will make the request, but only when we click the div, and we're not going to want to do that. So we'll say hx trigger is load. Now on page load, this request will be triggered. And what do we want to do with the response? We say hx swap after begin. And because this div is empty, after begin is just going to put the content of the response inside the div, or at the top of the div, or inside the div. hx target is going to be this. Let's restart the app, refresh the page, and that's what's happened. This content here is dynamically loaded on page load, and you've got the button because that partial has a button that knows that it should load more. And each time you get a new button, and at the end you reach the maximum page, and then you don't get the button anymore. And if you go to a different feed, the same thing happens. Now, sometimes there is some HTML within the summary, and it looks a bit dodgy. You can see that button there. I think that's actually because in the entry, we need to get rid of this safe filter to. It is actually not safe. So let's just refresh that. And some pages. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, there was a table thing in the content that was mucking things up. I remember this from when I was preparing the talk. Okay, so first part of this workshop, a bit of setup. This, I find this is super bizarre, but in a good way. that you can use HTMX to do this kind of thing. Any questions so far? Feel free to ask in the Discord or in the YouTube channel. I'll give you guys a wee minute. And if you are following along, I know it's a very fast coding that we're doing because obviously I've got everything already prepared. I encourage you to try this out. And the key takeaway from this part of the workshop is that you can define an endpoint that renders a template and you have some localized state within that template. And that template can then call the same endpoint again. It's kind of a recursive sort of calling. And that's what we're doing in here. We've got the entry page template and we pass to it the current page. And that template then grabs the next page. Okay, so let's continue with the next bit. And the next thing that we want to do is add the ability to add new RSS feeds to our dictionary of RSS feeds. We're going to add a button down here at the bottom left. And when we click the button, a form is going to show up. And submitting the form is going to create a new entry in our dictionary. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can do this. We can do this with just HTMX, or if you want a little bit more interactivity and a little bit more control, then we can bring in AlpineJS. I'll show you both ways, and I'll let you guys decide which one you like. So we need a new partial, add form.html. Sorry, that should be add feed.html. And this add feed.html is, again, a partial that just has the form. So let me grab the form. Here's just a plain HTML form. You can see that it is a form that has divs. Each div has a label and an input for the URL of the feed, the title of the feed, and whether we want to show images or not. I'm sure you've noticed by now that one of these doesn't have images and the other one does. That's just how I've kind of coded the using of the parsed feed, but I'm sure you could do this differently if you wanted. And finally, there is an input button which submits the form, and the action here is add feed. So we need to code this endpoint. Let's go into dunderini.py and deal with adding a feed. Now, you all know how to deal with forms in Flask. Add feed is the endpoint. We'll receive a post request and we just get the URL, title, and show images from the form. And then we create a dictionary with title, feed, show images, and an empty entries dictionary, and put it in our feeds. And then we redirect to render feed. So we need to import redirect and URL for. And I mean, nothing magical there, I hope. We'll also add an endpoint for rendering the add feed template. So we'll say render add feed, and this just renders the partial. This partial doesn't take any values, as you can see. So we don't need to pass anything to it. Now let's go into feed.html. And here in our navigation, we're going to add a button that when we click it, calls that endpoint that renders the form and allows us to display the form here on the page. So here under nav, and by the way, this is why all of these things were flex and flex column. this goes under nav. So the navigation bar will sort of take up all of the available space, and the form will show up at the very bottom. And so we've got this div, and in here we're going to do class flex justify center item center just to center the button, and then we'll have a button in there. So when we click this button, we want HTMX to make a request, and we want the button itself to be replaced by the form. So we'll say hx get, and it's URL for render add feed. Is that what we called it? Yes, it is. And hx swap is outer HTML. Hx target is this. And you can add some styling as well. And we'll add some text within the button to add. Let me do that. Okay, let's restart the app. Now we've got a button down there. Now when we click it, a request is made. You can see the request down here in our logs. And it shows up there. And because this is just a plain HTML form, it's very easy to deal with. We'll add bread cannons. That's it. And that's how you can use HTMX to render a form dynamically, to add stuff. And because of how we've wired our API, pagination works in here as well, and everything's pretty straightforward. So hopefully now you're starting to see how these different parts come together, and you're liking it. Now, there is one issue with doing it with HTMX, which is that hiding the form is a little bit more difficult. So another option is to show this form with AlpineJS, and that is probably easier even than using HTMX. So let me show you how you could use Alpine for that. And so the first thing that you do is here you would, let's add flex call in here, because now we're going to have two elements. We're going to have a div that is hidden to begin with, and that renders the partial of partials at feed.html. There you go. And then we've got the button that will hide or show. So we'll say show. So this is the sort of HTML side of things that you need in order to use AlpineJS for hiding and showing the form. The key difference when you're using JavaScript is that the HTML content, which is this form, is always on the page. It's not brought in dynamically by making a request. That means that you have fewer requests to make, which could be a nice thing. It won't, add as much load to your server, although it's a very small amount of load. But the page itself is a little bit larger. Now, to use AlpineJS, we need to give the Alpine component some state. So the initial state that we want this part of the page, this Alpine component, to have is that the form is hidden. So in the component, the div, the parent of whatever it is that you want to handle, we can say x data. And now here goes some JSON or some JavaScript objects. We'll say show false. And this defines the show variable within this component. This is now an Alpine component, and it is false to begin with. And then we can say this div x show show. And now this will only be shown when the show variable is truthy. So it will be hidden initially. And this button, we can say x on click, show equal true. Probably not show. And now the button will be able to show or hide the content. But we need to make that a bit clearer. So we'll say X text, another Alpine thing, show an eternity. If show is true, the text will be hide. Otherwise, it will be show. I think I made a mistake. Oh yeah. So here we're accessing feed and then Brett Cannon's feed, but obviously that one doesn't exist anymore. We've restarted our app and we're keeping everything in memory in our dictionary. So that isn't going to work. Now the button says show, and not the prettiest. I'm sure you can do much better than me in terms of styling, but you can show and hide the form. But the form is always there on the page. But the form still works because at the end of the day, it is still just an HTML form. And we are getting a page load. When we do that, you could boost the form using HTMX if you wanted to as well. But I think submitting a form and sort of having a page load is quite normal. But yeah, you can get the form to replace the page content as well. Okay, so that's the two ways that you can add this level of interactivity on your page. I really enjoy AlpineJS. I think the API is so minimalistic that it does the job while still being simple. But if you prefer using HTMX, you can do that. I think it's just a little bit more limited. And HTMX themselves in their documentation do say the same thing. They recommend various scripting libraries such as AlpineJS or Hyperscript. I've used Hyperscript a lot on the Teclado website itself. So either of those can work. Hyperscript just gets a little bit messy when you've got a lot of scripting going on. But yeah. The other benefit of using Alpine is we don't need this render add feed endpoint because we're never calling that endpoint. We're simply loading or hiding using JavaScript. And at that point, you could have a macro for the feed instead of a partial, but it doesn't matter whether you use a partial or a macro, so you might as well just use partials for this kind of stuff. But you could use a macro if you prefer, if that makes you feel better that partials are for things that need to be able to be rendered on their own, macros for things that don't need to be rendered on their own. Maybe that makes more sense in your head. So you can use a macro here. Instead of render partial, you would just render the macro. Okay. Let me check the chats. Remember, if you have any questions or any comments, you can question or comment in the Discord or on YouTube. Okay, now let's do something new. Let's add some entry read indicators. So for each entry, we will store whether we've read it or not, and we will show a little icon to that effect. So the first thing to do is to go to init.py. And here I've very nicely already laid this out so that it's easy to do. We're when we load the entries of a particular feed, we're going through all the entries and we're checking if the entry is not already in our entries dictionary. And if it isn't, we are adding it. Well, now instead of adding the entry, we're going to do entry read is false. So all the entries are going to be initially unread. And now we can use this property in our templates. We'll also create an endpoint to mark an entry as read. So we'll say app route, and this will be feed and path of feed URL, entry path of entry URL. We're going to use the entry and feed URLs to identify which one specifically we want to read. And by the way, this is something I don't really recommend doing even in rapid development, is have these paths in the URL. You're better off, if you're using a database, which I'm sure you would be, having feed ID and entry ID rather than URLs, because what happens if the feed has /entry within it or something like that, you're going to run into trouble. So best to use IDs if you have them. And we'll say read entry, and this takes in feed URL and entry URL. And all it does is it grabs the feed. Feed is feeds, feed URL. And entry is feed entries, entry URL. And we'll say entry read is boop. And then we'll just return redirect to entry URL. Now, when the entry is going to get marked as read when we click on it. So when we click on read article, that's when we're going to mark the entry as read. So we want to click this, mark the entry as read, and then redirect the user to the entry itself. And that actually poses some challenges. Okay. Because we can't use things that would assume that we're staying in the page, such as HTMX, exclusively anyway. Let's go to entry. And here we've got our title. We're going to add an SVG. Here's an SVG, which is 16 pixels square and renders a circle of 16 pixels. And with some TailwindCSS classes, we can define the size to be, actually, I'm not sure. I think that may be 12 pixels, but either way, it doesn't matter. And the color that is going to be filled with. And we're actually going to put this in to the H2. So we'll say H2, this there. Just a lint. So we're going to manually. We'll have the H2, then the SVG inside it. It's inline block, so it should render beside the text, and we'll put the title right beside it. All right. Now we need to do this if not read. We'll accept read status in the partial, and if read is not true, then we will render the SVG. Otherwise, we will not render the SVG. Okay. Sorry, I'm standing up and I'm reaching my limit of standing desk. All right, let me just check the notes, make sure I haven't missed anything. Yeah, okay. Let's go to entry page.html. And here in render partial, we need to change this slightly. 1 second. Two. As in. Okay, let's restart this. I'm deviating a little bit from my notes, so we might encounter some sort of errors. But anyway, here's your unread indicators. And when you click on one of them, hey, the indicator's still there. Okay, let's refresh the page. And it's still there because I've made some sort of mistake. 1 second, let me just see if I can find the mistake. The woes of live coding. Let me see if I can find this mistake. One sec. Let me try. This one. That's. I think I just forgot to do the most obvious thing, which is actually call the link. The link is not sending us to our link, so that's why it's not being marked as red. My bad. Let's change this. So instead of going to the link of the entry, it goes to our URL. Otherwise, obviously, it's not going to work. So we will click the link, send people to our endpoint that marks the entry as red, and then redirects them to the page. Start that and reload this. Read the article. Indicator still there, but if you refresh the page, then the indicator should go away, but it didn't. Why not? Why did you not go away? There must be another error somewhere. Well, I'm open to suggestions if anybody knows. But if not, give me just a minute. See if I can spot the issue. Live debugging, nothing better than that. Read entry. Key error. The feed wasn't passed. Probably I made a mistake. Yes, the thing is... Oh, feed URL is missing. Ah, there you go. Live debugging. So yeah, in the logs you can see /feed/entry and then the entry path, but it's missing the feed path. So feed URL needs to be passed as well when we call this. So we'll say feed URL is href. Is that right? I think it is. Yeah. Okay. Once more. Still no. How not? That should work, I think. Yes, a suggestion by someone, I think. Did I? Forgot to pass the read property. And so we've said it should accept it. We're saying it is there, and in entry page, it's there. So I think we're passing it. Red is false. But we can see. We'll just render it in there and see if something pops up. Yeah, it's false. I think it's there, but thank you for the suggestion. This is mildly embarrassing. Red item red. To be fair, in my notes, it uses dot notation, but I don't imagine that'll make any difference. I don't think. Maybe there's like two. That's weird. Now it's disappeared. Now it's reappeared. Something weird's going on. I'm not sure why that's not working, but I think it matches my notes. Strange. Anyway, this code will be available. I've got it. I've got it in my notes, and it all seems to be okay. There. If any other suggestions, if not, I'll take 2 minutes silently to try and figure this out. Maybe we can crop this out of the video later on. But it should work. Anyway, you can. This is probably even more entertaining than a conference talk itself. Let's see. So entries is there when we have the entry. When you refresh the page, doesn't it repopulate the entries as unread? It shouldn't, no, because the server doesn't restart. So the entry is already in the entries dictionary. Ah, you have a very good point, sir. This should be that. Ah, nice one. Obviously, that is never true. Entry link is never a dictionary because it's a string anyway. So it should be not in, so that we're checking whether the link is not in the keys of the dictionary. So you were right. It does. It shouldn't because of that typo. It does repopulate the entry as unread. But when we do this, it won't. The cache would be a good shout if this was in prod, but because it's not in prod, there you go. And because it's not in prod, it's locally, there's no caching, at least not in Arc. There you go. So I think we would have got there eventually, but that was a very good suggestion. So thank you very much for saving my skin. There you go. Those two things are very similar to each other. I feel like that should be like, I don't know, some sort of linter would have said, hey, this is never going to be true if we had strong typing, but we don't. Okay, so there you go. Fixed. Now we can also go back into the entry and get rid of this. Okay, so you've seen, now that this is solved, that when we read an article, it's marked as read. And as long as you do things properly, this remains unread until you refresh the page. Now, if we were not using, if we were clicking the article and showing the article within this page, we could use HTMX to reload the page contents with the new information without doing a page load. And in that case, the page would know that this is now read and the indicator could be made to go away. But because we are redirecting to another page and opening a new tab, we are not receiving a response in this page. So HTMX can't be made to modify the page content. That would require two responses. One, which is the 302 redirect to the article, and a separate response that changes the page content, and we can't do that. So what we've got so far is good, but if we want to, as soon as we click the link, make the indicator disappear, we again need AlpineJS. So let's do it. So you guys are actually watching, eh? You're not commenting, but you know what's going on. That's good. Now I feel like you guys are watching. That's good. This was all a trick to make sure that you were watching. Let's bring in AlpineJS. So what we want to do is store whether the thing is read or unread in an AlpineJS property. Then when we click the link, we will set it to read in the front end only, and the Flask endpoint will set it to read in the back end. So the thing will appear read in the front end, and when we refresh the page, it will appear read because the backend has updated as well. So we'll keep two separate states until the page is reloaded, but that's okay. So we need to be able to hide this using AlpineJS. So we need to make a Alpine component from the parent of this SVG. So that would be the H2. But we want to trigger the showing and or the hiding of that SVG from this A element. So we're actually going to make this div, right? The parent. Yeah, this div will be the Alpine component so that we can trigger it with this and hide this. So it has to contain both the trigger and the thing you're actually targeting. So we'll say X data. And we're going to say red is, and we can say here in JavaScript, of course, false. But we don't want red to always be false. We want red to be whether the entry is read or not as it comes from our backend. So I'm sure you remember from when we were debugging a second ago that the red property in JinJa that we can display like this is a Python true or false, so capital T or capital F. But it's actually a string. It's not a Boolean once we interpolate it into the page. So what we want to say is red is red, but that has an uppercase F or an uppercase T. So it's not valid JavaScript. So we have to lower it in order to turn it into a lowercase string. And then AlpineJS will treat it as JavaScript, and it will be a proper Boolean. So that's a little bit of a confusing thing. But nonetheless, it's what we must do. Now, we can get rid of this if statement, simplify, and this SVG, we can say X show only if not read. Let's Now this behaves exactly the same way as it did before, but we're using JavaScript instead of just a JinJa if statement. And now in the button, we can still keep the href, but we can add something to happen on click. So we'll say x on click. And what we want to do on click is say red is true. We're never going to want to say red equal not red, because we're not going to unread an element, an item. So red equal true is fine. All right, let's restart. When we restart the app, you're right that everything gets reset because the dictionaries are in memory. Now, when we load a page, that disappears immediately without doing a page load because it's kept in local state. And when we refresh the page, because we've set it in our backend, it also works and it stays unread. Okay, so that is simple enough, right? I mean, it's starting to get a bit more complicated, but this is how you can add some interactivity within an element that you want to sync with the backend. If you need the state of the element to change locally on the page before a page load, you have to use a little bit of JavaScript to modify the page. Keep that simple. That's my advice with this kind of stuff. Hide or show an element, change the style of an element or something like that is fine. But I don't recommend making big changes to the page just because it gets complicated, and that's sort of anti-rapid development. You want to keep things simple. But now, what if we want to change an element that isn't part of the same component? So here's what I'm talking about. Let's add our final feature in this workshop, which is going to be a badge with the number of unread entries in the feed. And the badge is going to be here in the navigation. So it gets a little bit more complicated because the entry page and the feed information is, well, first of all, each entry knows whether it's read or not. And you've got the entry page that loads the different entries. But the information about the number of unreads is kind of separated in two places, especially while you are in the page. When you read an article, this entry knows it's not read, but how will the badge update? Well, that's what we're going to look at. First of all, let's go into feed.html. And here in feed.html, but first let me bring up my notes so we don't make any more mistakes, because I have a lot of notes, but I'm only kind of using them. Okay, so here in feed.html, we've got the feed information, and each feed has the dictionary of entries, and each entry has a read property. So we can very easily add like, let me add a span tag in here, an inline element that will show us how many unread elements are in this feed. So we'll say feed entries values. This is all of the entries. Now we want to only keep those that have a read property of false. So we'll say a JinJa filter. This is a built-in reject attribute, read. It will remove any values from this iterable that have a read attribute of true. We'll turn it into a list, and then we'll get the length. Okay, let me refresh this. You have it, 15 and 72. But obviously, when we click on read article, that doesn't update. When we refresh the page, it does update. So how do we handle this? Because only the entry has the state of being read or not read until we do a page load. Well, this is where we get to one of the most fun parts of AlpineJS and Hyperscript. Both scripting libraries have this functionality of event-driven development. And event-driven development used to be a big thing. Back when I started learning, my dad was doing a lot of event-driven development stuff. But it sort of fell out of popularity. But it's great because what we have here is an event. We are reading an entry, or we're clicking the link to go to the entry. And in response to that event, we can reduce the badge count. We can say instead of 15, it's going to be 14 when we receive an event of a new entry being read. And this stuff with event-driven development really makes this level of dynamism in your website quite straightforward. Whereas if you want to keep or the brute force approach of doing this, keeping some sort of global state in your website, and so the brute force approach would keep all the entries in global state in JavaScript. When you read one, you reload the entire page, or you recalculate what elements use the red status, and you re-render those elements. That's React and Redux. That is very heavyweight for what we're doing here. With event-driven development, it's very minimal and very straightforward. So let me show you how to do that. Let's go to entry.html, and we will on-click dispatch an event that will be catchable by other elements in the page, and they can update themselves in response to this event. This sort of event-driven development I prefer in AlpineJS than I do in Hyperscript, because in Hyperscript you have to send the event to a particular element. In Alpine, you simply dispatch the element, and any other component can subscribe to it. So I find that a little bit nicer. So let's dispatch. We'll say $dispatch. Give the jQuery style. Dollars PHP. Oh, this is lovely. Anyway, $dispatch, and then we'll say red. This is the name of the event that we are dispatching, and we also want to say whether the red variable is true or false. So we'll say red is red. So red, this is a JavaScript object. Red is the key. This is the variable that we are putting in there. So it'll be either true or false. But we actually want to do this before we set red to true. Otherwise, that will always be true. So we say dispatch red. The first time that we click the link, this will be false. And in that case, we can reduce the badge count. Every other subsequent time, this will be true, and we won't reduce the badge count. We only want to reduce it when we actually read a new article, not when we click on an article that we've already read. That's it. Now, this is available to any Alpine component that is a parent of this link. So that's an important point. This link is within this div. So any element within this div can subscribe to this red event and can respond to it. And you could actually just do that instead of using state. But I think state for a small component is fine. It's easy enough. Now we want this event to bubble up to the feed navigation. So there are a few ways to do that. You can put everything inside a div and make that a component that you only use for event subscriptions. Or you can simply go to base.html, and in the spirit of rapid development, we would say xdata. Just putting xdata on any element makes it an Alpine component, but you don't have to store state. You can just say, okay, this element is a component, so when there are events that can be sent up to the body and then captured by any child elements. Then we go into the feed.html, and here this span is going to subscribe to that event, and it's going to do something when that event appears. So what does it have to do? Well, it has to say, we say at red.window, this is how you subscribe to an event that isn't within the same component as the emitter. So back to entry. This event we could subscribe using, @red in here, because the SVG and the A are in the same Alpine component. But if they are not in the same Alpine component, then you do red.window, because you're capturing a global event. What we want to do is reduce the badge count. So we'll say $element, which is the element that we are currently in. So that's this span, inner HTML. And now we're going to use something beautiful from JavaScript, -=1. This is something that shouldn't work, obviously, because this is a string when it's in the HTML. But in JavaScript, if you have a string that is actually a number and you subtract 1 from it, JavaScript's fine. It will simply turn it into a number and subtract 1. Let's try this. So we've got 15 and 72. We're going to read an article. Now we've got 14 and 71. So obviously there's some filtering that we need to do to make sure that we're only reducing from the currently active feed. So here, instead of $element inner HTML -=1, we're going to do JinJa interpolation, and we'll do on event do this, but only if we are currently in the active feed, which we already had here for the class name, else do nothing. Now let's restart this. Now we read an article. It's 14 and 72. We read another one, 13 and 72, and so on. Just for completeness, let's go over to this one, and you can see that that also works. Okay, so that is everything. So let me bring this up here. So yeah, that's everything that I wanted to share with you today in this workshop. We're finishing just ahead of time. I had planned 2 hours, but that's it, 1 hour and 40. So hopefully you've learned something new about how to use these technologies together to add some interactivity, but still build new features quickly. We were doing some live coding. Obviously, I had some stuff prepared, but it didn't take me that much longer to develop this app than what we've done here on the stream, maybe 4 or 5 hours. So it's quite a rapid way to develop with interactivity, with JavaScript, while still keeping things quite simple and very minimalistic. So I hope that you've enjoyed the session. I'm here if you have any questions. I'm also in the Palettes Discord, and I will be sharing there the documentation, which I've got here. Let me bring this in here. Oh, there you go. Here, there. So this page I will be sharing in the Palettes Discord as well as on my Twitter. So follow me on Twitter or join the Palettes Discord if you want access to this, as well as the full repository of the different steps in the code that we've built, as well as the final code in case you want to have a look at that. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, or any comments, or you think this is all garbage, I'm here. Let me also play. Yeah. UI Licks, thank you very much. Glad you enjoyed it. Appreciate you, and thank you for the help with the live debugging. All right, I will click on end stream, and the video will be available here in the FlaskCon YouTube. Remember, any questions, we are on the Discord and we can catch up asynchronously. Oh, Drac, why AlpineJS? You need JavaScript to make a website interactive. So that means changing the website content without reloading the page. HTMX does that for you with JavaScript by making a request and then replacing some of the website content with whatever your Flask server responds with. But sometimes that is a bit inflexible, because you just want to make a small change to something in the site. You don't want to reload a whole bunch of new content. So that's where scripting libraries like Alpine or Hyperscript come into play. I'll show you another example, actually. Let me bring in this. No, actually, sorry. Let me bring in, this. Here's another example of using a scripting language that you just cannot do with only HTMX. Look at this here. As you scroll down the page, the current thing that you're looking at goes less transparent, gets a different color, right? This you cannot do by replacing content from the server. You have to do this with JavaScript. You have to see what's currently visible, and then there's an event that triggers that tells these elements to change color. So that's the kind of what we've done with Alpine and the badge, using the observer API to do that. You could add a hamburger menu for smaller screens. Sam, yeah, definitely. Yeah, we've got that in here as well. Adding the hamburger is a very popular thing to do. You can find the code to add a hamburger menu with AlpineJS almost anywhere. That's why I didn't cover it. I wanted to show you a few different ways of doing things, but yeah, definitely we use AlpineJS for this in here. Jacob, do you get the code in the GitHub? Yes. So I will publish this page so you can access it. And this page and the code will also be on GitHub, so you can look at it. So this will be readable as is, and also it'll be on GitHub. Okay. Thank you very much for joining and for commenting. I'll check the Discord, actually, see if there's any questions there. No, nothing on Discord. So yeah, thank you very much, guys. I appreciate you. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that you'll find use for HTMX, AlpineJS, TailwindCSS, or maybe Hyperscript. Check out Hyperscript. It's also quite nice. Thank you very much. Yeah, and I'll see you next time.